On the biting cold evening of December 5th, 1484, as twilight cast heavy shadows over the imposing walls of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, a fate that would shape Europe's psychological landscape for centuries was being decided within the Apostolic Palace. The melting candles on heavy oak tables threw long, dancing shadows across a parchment destined to become one of the most terrifying documents in human history. Before the pontiff, Innocent VIII, lay the draft of a papal bull. Its title, Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, desiring with supreme ardor, sounded almost pious. Yet, a bottomless abyss lurked beneath these words, ready to swallow thousands of lives. In that exact moment, the only sound breaking the silence of the study was the scratching of a quill, drafting the letters that would weaponize ancient superstitions into a doctrine of state. This text did not merely acknowledge the existence of dark forces, it declared total war against them, institutionalizing paranoia and dread as the primary tools of justice. No one in that room could have fathomed that this single stroke of ink would act as the spark to ignite pyres across the continent, transforming tranquil villages and thriving towns into a theater of endless paranoia, hunting for enemies hiding in plain sight. The world of the late 15th century existed in a strange, agonizing state of suspense. It was an era of monumental discoveries, yet simultaneously a time of profound collective anxiety. Less than a decade remained before Christopher Columbus would set sail for the shores of the New World, and Johannes Gutenberg's printing press had already begun its quiet revolution, spreading ideas faster than ever before. However, alongside this enlightenment, a dark shadow of psychological distress was creeping across Europe. The old feudal systems were fracturing, urban centers were swelling, and with them came a surge in disease and social inequality. In the minds of people living in that era, the boundary between harsh reality and the supernatural was as fragile as thin glass. Crop failures, sudden livestock deaths, or inexplicable illnesses were not viewed as natural phenomena, but as the direct result of hostile supernatural intervention. The Church, which for centuries had served as the ultimate anchor of stability, was itself navigating a severe crisis, torn apart by internal contradictions and fierce power struggles. It was precisely within this climate of mass insecurity that a desperate psychological need arose for a simple explanation to all societal woes. If their world was collapsing, it meant someone was intentionally destroying it. Innocent VIII, who had ascended to the papal throne just months before signing the fatal bull, found himself in an incredibly precarious situation. His reign began amidst a depleted treasury, constant military threats from the Ottoman Empire to the east, and intense pressure from powerful Italian rival families domestically. Giovanni Battista Cibo, as he was known before his election, possessed neither the iron will of his predecessors nor the intellectual brilliance of his successors. He was entirely a man of his time, prone to political compromise, burdened by numerous relatives needing lucrative appointments, and suffering from deteriorating health. He was surrounded by advisors, each driven by personal agendas, but the most relentless among them was a man with burning eyes and an unshakable, almost delusional certainty in his own righteousness. The Dominican inquisitor Heinrich Kramer. It was Kramer who became the driving psychological force that compelled the sluggish machinery of the Vatican bureaucracy to birth the document that launched the Great Hunt. Operating in the German territories, Heinrich Kramer had faced intense resistance from local authorities and even the clergy. In those days, many bishops and secular rulers viewed tales of night flights and demonic pacts with a healthy dose of skepticism. They saw these narratives more as collective delusions or manifestations of mental illness rather than a literal threat to the faith. To Kramer, whose mind operated on pure fanaticism, such skepticism was tantamount to treason. He desperately needed an undeniable supreme authority, a legal shield that would allow him to bypass local magistrates entirely. He arrived in Rome, armed with a report full of horrifying, fabricated details about a massive conspiracy brewing in the northern lands, one capable of destroying Christianity itself. Innocent VIII, cognitively primed to perceive any disorder as a direct threat to his already fragile authority, eagerly listened to these claims. The bull Summis Desiderantes Affectibus became the ultimate response to these anxieties, officially confirming that those who allegedly consorted with dark forces were not merely misguided, but literal criminals subject to the most merciless persecution imaginable. The ratification of this document engineered an unprecedented legal paradigm. Previously, the Church's canon law relied on the so-called canon episcopi, dating back to the 10th century, which asserted that the belief in witchcraft and broomstick flights was merely an illusion induced by the devil. In other words, the crime was the belief in such things, not the actual practice of magic. Innocent VIII's bull violently flipped this psychological logic upside down. Now, denying the physical reality of malicious witchcraft became a symptom of complicity or a dangerous heresy itself. This was a theological maneuver of colossal destructive power. It didn't just authorize inquisitors to act, it mandated them to actively seek out signs of magical intervention in every misfortune. The document meticulously cataloged the alleged sins: destroying crops, causing male impotence, drying up pastures, and disrupting daily life. Consequently, any mundane hardship was immediately elevated to the status of a severe spiritual crime. The external conflict of this period unfolded against the backdrop of a massive collision between ancient ecclesiastical privileges and the new ambitions of centralized state power. In the German principalities, where the emperor's influence was largely nominal and every city fiercely guarded its own rights, the arrival of inquisitors wielding papal authority was perceived as a direct assault on local sovereignty. Local judges were highly reluctant to surrender their citizens to traveling fanatics. However, the text of the bull was so manipulatively crafted that any opposition to an inquisitor could be instantly reframed as obstructing the holy faith, a charge that carried catastrophic consequences. Kramer and his allies were granted the absolute power to demand compliance from secular authorities under the threat of excommunication. This engineered a psychological environment where the sheer terror of Rome eclipsed logic, reason, and the basic duty to protect one's own citizens. The political map of Europe began to be covered by a web of tribunals where due process devolved into a hollow formality, designed solely to validate a predetermined guilty verdict. The internal psychological reality of the people living through these events was equally harrowing. For the average citizen, the world was heavily populated by invisible entities, and the line between praying for rain and casting a spell for luck was incredibly blurred. Women, who for generations had been the custodians of herbal medicine and midwifery, suddenly found themselves under the most intense and hostile scrutiny. Someone who was a respected healer yesterday could be accused today of drawing their power from demonic forces rather than divine grace. The personal choice of every individual, whether to remain silent as a neighbor was dragged to an interrogation chamber or to speak out in their defense, became a literal matter of life and death, testing the limits of human self-preservation. This atmosphere of ubiquitous paranoia rapidly disintegrated centuries-old community bonds. Driven either by genuine internalized terror for their immortal soul or by a dark desire to resolve petty domestic disputes, a son might denounce his mother, or a husband his wife. In this twisted sense, the witch hunt became the perfect mechanism for scapegoating and settling personal scores, heavily disguised under the righteous cloak of religious purity. The ideological conflict lay in the fundamental dissonance between emerging Renaissance humanism and a fading, yet increasingly aggressive, medieval mindset. The Renaissance, which we typically view as the ultimate triumph of reason, possessed a profoundly dark underbelly. The renewed fascination with antiquity resurrected not only Platonic philosophy, but also ancient magical traditions. Prominent intellectuals of the era, such as Marsilio Ficino or Pico della Mirandola, engaged in serious studies of Hermeticism and astrology. Through the eyes of the Church, this created dangerous cognitive dissonance. If a highly educated philosopher could openly debate the influence of the stars, why couldn't a simple peasant woman believe in the power of an incantation? The Church's desperate attempt to clearly delineate between a sanctioned miracle and forbidden witchcraft resulted in the creation of convoluted intellectual frameworks that would later form the core of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum. This clash of ideas fundamentally revolved around the limits of human agency and cognition. Who has the right to manipulate the world? Only God through his ordained representatives, or individuals through the hidden forces of nature? Innocent VIII's bull delivered a brutal, unequivocal answer. Any influence operating outside the strict ecclesiastical hierarchy was deemed illegal, terrifying, and inherently evil. The ultimate turning point arrived when Heinrich Kramer, heavily armed with his papal mandate, realized that a single piece of parchment was insufficient for systematic psychological warfare. He urgently needed a comprehensive operational manual, a text that would instruct every judge precisely how to profile an enemy, how to conduct psychological interrogations, and how to interpret a suspect's silence or tears as absolute proof of guilt. Thus, the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was born, becoming an instant bestseller largely thanks to the recent innovation of the printing press. Kramer's dark genius lay in his manipulative decision to print the text of the papal bull at the very beginning of his manuscript. This engineered the powerful illusion that the entire book, complete with its graphic and deeply disturbing interrogation protocols, possessed the full, unyielding endorsement of the Vatican. In reality, many esteemed theologians of the time, including those at the University of Cologne, strongly condemned Kramer's methods as highly unethical and legally illegitimate. But the persuasive magic of the printed word and the immense authority of the papal seal overrode all logical objections. The book was disseminated in thousands of copies, heavily infecting the collective consciousness even in the most remote corners of Europe. The viral spread of this text fundamentally corrupted the very mechanics of the justice system. The concept of an exceptional crime was heavily injected into legal proceedings, completely nullifying standard rules of evidence. Because witchcraft was inherently classified as a covert, invisible act, mere rumors, forced confessions under extreme duress, or even the simple lack of a concrete alibi were deemed sufficient for a fatal conviction. This completely obliterated the presumption of innocence, replacing it with a vicious presumption of guilt. The judicial machine became entirely self-replicating. Every new trial systematically generated a fresh list of accomplices, named under agonizing torture, who in turn named others. It became a psychological avalanche that was impossible to halt until it either exhausted its own momentum or completely devastated the economies of entire regions, leaving virtually no one alive to tend the fields. The horrific climax of this phenomenon peaked in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Yet the foundational architecture was firmly established on that cold December night in 1484. Across Europe, human tragedies unfolded on a scale that is deeply difficult for the modern mind to fully process. In prominent German cities like Bamberg and Würzburg, the trials morphed into episodes of pure mass hysteria, where even high-ranking officials and local magistrates found themselves violently dragged onto the lists of the accused. Social status no longer provided any psychological armor. Women, who constituted the overwhelming majority of the victims, were heavily targeted not merely due to religious dogmatism, but because of a deeply internalized cultural anxiety regarding their independence, their alternative knowledge, or their vulnerable social standing. It was a bleak era, where a society grappling with profound systemic changes chose to brutally sacrifice its most vulnerable demographics in exchange for a delusional sense of security and control over the creeping chaos. The psychological transformation that occurred within the European consciousness carried massive, long-lasting consequences. The witch hunts essentially trained both state and ecclesiastical institutions in the dark arts of mass behavioral control and the weaponization of public fear. An incredibly efficient, decentralized system of surveillance and informants was engineered, a blueprint that would later be heavily adopted by totalitarian secular regimes. However, the most profound shift occurred in how human autonomy and the mind were perceived. The human psyche was aggressively reframed as a passive battlefield, where every thought or action might be dictated by hostile, external entities. This bred a devastating sense of alienation, fracturing an individual's trust both in themselves and in their neighbors. Paradoxically, it was precisely this intense period of institutionalized cruelty and mass delusion that eventually catalyzed the rise of scientific rationality. The intellectuals of subsequent generations, witnessing the catastrophic psychological fallout of unchecked fanaticism, began fiercely demanding rigorous empirical standards in courtrooms and a clear, objective understanding of natural laws, totally stripped of demonic interpretations. The psychological resonance of the late 15th century is still intensely palpable today, even if the cultural backdrop has shifted. The narrative of Pope Innocent VIII and his bull is not merely an obscure historical footnote. It serves as a glaring case study in how institutional power can be seamlessly leveraged to legalize collective hatred. In any era where a society faces rapid technological shifts, severe economic downturns, or ambiguous global threats, an overwhelming cognitive temptation arises to identify a scapegoat, an other, upon whom all societal anxieties can be projected. The psychological mechanics of scapegoating remain remarkably consistent. First, a deeply dehumanized caricature of the enemy is carefully constructed. Next, legal frameworks are altered to completely strip this group of basic rights. And finally, the machinery of systemic repression is fully activated, accompanied by the thunderous applause of a deeply terrified public. We witness chilling echoes of this exact behavioral loop in modern information warfare, the tribal dynamics of cancel culture, and the alarming readiness with which societies will eagerly surrender their civil liberties in exchange for the hollow promise of absolute safety. It remains fundamentally crucial to understand a terrifying psychological reality. The men who drafted the bull and authored the Malleus Maleficarum absolutely did not perceive themselves as villains. In their deeply insular worldview, They were executing acts of profound mercy, actively saving human souls from eternal torment. This highlights history's most chilling paradox. The most catastrophic atrocities are frequently committed with the best of intentions, heavily reinforced by an unshakable, dogmatic certainty that one possesses the absolute truth. The ultimate tragedy of Innocent VIII was rooted in his personal weakness and his passive willingness to flow with the political current, allowing extreme radicals to dictate the overarching narrative. His historical footprint demonstrates that silent compliance, or the bureaucratic signing of a document whose psychological ramifications one refuses to fully grasp, can trigger apocalyptic consequences. True leadership demands accountability not only for direct actions, but for the systemic horrors allowed to flourish under one's seal. Today, as we analyze the digital scans of these ancient texts, or read the clinical transcripts of those horrific trials, it is dangerously easy to adopt a posture of moral superiority over our primitive ancestors. However, we must continuously remind ourselves that the core architecture of the human psyche has barely evolved over the past 500 years, even as our technology has advanced exponentially. The deep-seated cognitive bias favoring simple answers to incredibly complex problems, the tribal urge to aggressively unify against a fabricated enemy, and the astonishing susceptibility to utterly absurd conspiracy theories remain fully intact. These psychological vulnerabilities have simply mutated, migrating seamlessly from dusty theological treatises directly into algorithmic social media feeds and polarizing political rhetoric. The Great Hunt did not end because humanity suddenly experienced a massive leap in empathy. It ended because legal frameworks became far more rigorous, and the societal cost of judicial errors became cognitively unbearable. This serves as a stark reminder that our only true defense against the repetition of such mass psychosis is not mere technological progress, but the uncompromising defense of legal due process and the active cultivation of critical thinking capable of dismantling collective hysteria. Circling back to that freezing winter night in Rome, we observe a pontiff pressing his heavy seal onto the parchment. At that exact moment, his mind was likely occupied with immediate political calculations, how to suppress the unrest in the German territories and heavily reinforce the centralized authority of the Vatican. He actively failed to visualize the faces of the thousands of men and women whose entire psychological and physical realities would be obliterated by that single document. He could not hear the roaring of the flames that would heavily scar the town squares of Europe for 2 more centuries. To him, it was merely an administrative task, a mundane piece of bureaucratic management within a massive, complex organization. Yet, herein lies the ultimate psychological lesson. Within the corridors of power, abstract words instantly materialize into physical realities, and clinical legal formulas morph into devastating kinetic forces, capable of either profound creation or total destruction. The enduring shadow of Innocent VIII serves as a grim warning that every policy drafted and every signature affixed to legislation regarding human rights generates a massive historical echo that resonates far longer than the lifespan of its author. The world slowly cooled from its fever pitch of fanaticism, but the psychological scars became permanent fixtures of the human condition. The witch trials engineered modern Western culture just as profoundly as the breathtaking art of the Renaissance. They strictly defined our modern concepts of legal justice, the non-negotiable boundaries of personal autonomy, and the heavily restricted role of the state in the private life of the individual. Comprehending exactly how this mass psychosis was triggered is essential not merely to judge the distant past, but to accurately diagnose the early warning signs of an impending psychological storm in our present reality. When collective fear begins to actively dictate public policy, and when paranoid suspicion is heavily rebranded as a civic virtue, it is an absolute guarantee that somewhere a new hammer is being carefully forged, fully capable of smashing our stable reality into unrecognizable fragments. The heavy silence of the 15th century papal study has long since been replaced by the relentless noise of modern digital civilization. But that single piece of parchment, still preserved deep within the Vatican's secret archives, functions as a mute, terrifying testament to the human capacity to fully weaponize belief systems. The saga of Innocent VIII operates as a psychological mirror into which every generation must peer, if only to verify that their own hands are not actively drafting the foundational texts of tomorrow's witch hunt. Ultimately, the only true victory over the darkness is not found in aggressively hunting it down within others, but in successfully dismantling the psychological shadows within ourselves, actively rejecting the dangerously easy path of collective hatred in favor of the incredibly difficult labor of radical empathy and rational understanding. For many decades following the death of Innocent VIII, historians and behavioral scientists have attempted to deconstruct his massive, bloody legacy. Some profile him as a tragic victim of overwhelming circumstances. Others diagnose him as a quiet fanatic or simply an incredibly incompetent administrator. Yet, beneath all these analytical labels lies one undeniable, terrifying fact. Once an institutionalized system of persecution is fully activated, it generates a psychological inertia that is almost impossible to break. That papal bull served as the absolute point of no return, the moment when open dialogue was permanently replaced by authoritarian dictates, and empirical investigation was entirely supplanted by hostile interrogation. This horrific mutation of faith into an unyielding, aggressive ideological weapon serves as a blaring warning siren for all subsequent eras. Ideas possess massive, tangible consequences, and the more universally applied those ideas are, the heavier the psychological and moral responsibility for their actualization becomes. Concluding this dark historical analysis, we find ourselves standing right back at that very desk in the year 1484. The ink has fully dried, the wax seal is deeply set, and the courier is already saddling his horse to transport the ideological virus across the Alps. Everything that is about to unfold feels entirely inevitable. Yet, at every single juncture, every single participant possessed agency and a choice. The Pope had the psychological freedom to refuse the signature. Kramer had the choice to stop fabricating lies. Local magistrates had the power to firmly demand empirical evidence. Neighbors had the agency to actively refuse to bear false witness. The massive arc of human history is constructed from millions of these micro-decisions, and it is precisely within human agency that true hope resides. Because if mass terror can be instantly legalized by a single stroke of a pen, then fundamental human sanity and truth are heavily defended by every single refusal to participate in systemic injustice, regardless of the personal cost. The devastating echo of Innocent VIII's bull only truly falls silent the moment we fully internalize that the ultimate court of justice is not the one held in the public square fueled by mass hysteria, but the one conducted in the quiet sanctity of our own conscience, a space where there is absolutely no room for witch hunts, only an endless, rational pursuit of the light and truth found within every human being we encounter. Consequently, the narrative of Pope Innocent VIII and his deeply infamous decree serves as a chilling, permanent reminder of just how incredibly fragile the psychological boundary between societal order and violent tyranny truly is. In a highly anxious world where individuals constantly seek a convenient scapegoat for their deep-seated fears, this historical case study effectively trains us to look far beyond superficial, emotionally charged accusations. We clearly observe how major institutions, originally designed to protect human well-being, can be seamlessly inverted into highly efficient engines of destruction if their core operating system is driven by paranoia rather than empathy. In this perpetual cognitive battle between reason and hysteria, each of us actively continues to write our own psychological chapter, constantly choosing between the heavy hammer used to crush dissent and the open hand extended in radical understanding. It is only through this rigorous self-awareness that we can absolutely guarantee that the dark psychological shadows of our history do not inevitably become the waking nightmare of our future.